So we started this module talking about the stated intents of land use regulation. And so it wouldn't be fair unless we talked about some of the challenges in land use regulation in achieving those objectives. The first one we have here is balancing competing interests. So, as we discussed in the first module on economics, there's always going to be trade offs in any kind of economic or policy decision. And so this is also the case with land use regulation. So, we've talked about several of them just throughout these videos. For example, let's just give a couple more. On one hand, there are special interests and constituencies in the country and in communities that want to maintain open space to have recreational use, for hiking, for mountain biking, etc. But then on the other hand, some of these areas may be in locations that are suitable to build housing or build more development. And so in California, this has been a challenge in that we have this need for a housing and also a competing interest to maintain open space. And so there's a trade-off here, right? When you uh, leave land undevelopable to maintain it as open space, you're also reducing the amount of land available to kind of add supply that you would want to do if you really wanted to kind of uh, have an impact on housing prices. Some would argue that you could just build more density in the places that already are developed. But we've talked about some of the barriers there with CEQA, with zoning, and just frankly the cost of construction. Building up is much more expensive than just building kind of lower height structures. Another example is uh, adding density uh, to a particular area. So building, kind of taller buildings and having more people live there. Maybe the roads are not adequately wide enough to accommodate the traffic that's going to be a result of that. So you're going to have more traffic, you're going to have more noise as you add density. So that's going to change the characteristics of a neighborhood by adding density. So there's a trade-off there that has to be made. And you can even talk about larger projects like the Keystone XL pipeline. On one hand, it would have been a big win for energy costs for consumers because you could then transport a lot of natural gas uh, to the places it's needed with the pipeline. But on the other hand, you're taking a risk. Okay, so if something happens to that pipeline, it could cause some environmental challenges. It's also, I guess, the controversy was that it's cutting through certain land that was owned by tribal, like Native American tribes, I believe, was part of the controversy. So, there's going to be some trade-offs if you want to preserve kind of that the historical kind of legacy, then you're gonna have to end up paying higher energy costs. So I think a lot of the times people don't realize these trade-offs and they are making decisions just based on kind of the more emotionally salient or emotionally powerful argument, but they're not seeing what the costs are. And energy costs, housing costs, these are all affecting kind of lower income people and those parts of society that maybe aren't affected by, you know, 5% higher energy costs or gas prices or food costs. They may side on the more kind of emotionally appealing perspective and not consider the impacts on other segments of the population. Okay, and we've kind of mentioned higher prices, so um, the cost of regulation uh, tends to be higher prices because there's going to be some cost in complying with the regulation, and this is certainly uh, can be argued as the case for housing and just kind of uh, you can even argue there's regulation on gasoline in California. It requires a certain formulation, and so there's only certain refineries that produce that formulation. So there's a more limited supply, so that causes our gasoline in California to be higher. So land use regulation is also going to fit into this bucket where there's going to be more time involved with, like for example, CEQA to do all the studies that are required. You have to see, what animals live there, what the impact to the traffic will be, what the impact to native vegetation will be. You're going to have to do all these studies that are going to cost money. You're going to have to hire consultants. You're going to have to spend the time to do it. You have to wait for the government to review everything and approve it. So this is all going to lead to higher costs in general. Adapting to change. So we looked in Oakland at the zoning map there, and cities are constantly changing, slowly over time. Different uses become obsolete potentially, and maybe the needs of the city are different. So, Oakland had a little period of time where a lot of companies thought, hey, instead of San Francisco, this was probably in the mid 2010s. Um, they said, hey, rents are really high in San Francisco. Why not Oakland? And so Oakland had a big need for office space. So, the needs of a city are evolving over time, and the zoning and land use regulation has to be responsive to those changes, and it isn't always because the land use regulation is ultimately controlled by city council, and there's a whole process that goes into uh, creating or redoing zoning and kind of approving even zoning variances. It's not always the most adaptable to changing circumstances. And then finally, one of the stated goals was social equity for kind of land use regulation. I think we've talked about some of the ways that uh, regulation can make things more expensive, and that tends to affect lower income people more than higher income people. Um, so, it's unclear whether these land use regulations meant to kind of help create a more like a certain social outcome actually leads to that. You can argue that in California, which has a lot of land use regulation as compared to other places in the country, it also has kind of the largest wealth gap, or one of the largest wealth gaps among all states in the country. Now, I'm not going to say that's just because of land use regulation, because we also have industries that create a lot of wealth in the state. Um, but the cost of living has been a consistent problem in California for a long time, and especially housing.